Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me. This is a slightly surreal to give a lecture over the internet, not being able to see one's audience. I suppose a little bit like being a hospital radio DJ. As a late of the guards, I wore a tie. I was reading in the FT this weekend about how the Zoom and Microsoft Teams culture has been the death of the tie, and the mark of sartorial standards to continue wearing one even when one's on the internet. So I took my cue from there. So 100 years ago, or 103 years ago, I should say, to the day, the Gordon Highlanders were dug in about 500 meters short of Fontaine Notre Dame. Royal Welsh Fusiliers and the Green Howards were shivering in the dank darkness of Boulogne Wood after an exhausting battle and days fighting. And I was driving home from work through woods here in Wiltshire and sparing a thought for the relative miseries of an infantry soldier consolidating a position after dark. So it's a very good work by David and the gang, I think, to schedule this particular talk on also close to the period of the battle, because it really does make it easier to envision and focuses the mind. This is my third talk for the Western Front Association, and hitherto I've rambled on about tunneling operations as a mark of my affiliation with the Durand Group and my close interest in Great War tunneling and Messines. And so when we discussed the possibility of jumping onto this webinar circuit, I thought maybe it would be nice to change it up and speak about the tank. It's really interesting to me in my day job of late how many people are starting to question the value of tanks on a modern battlefield. And in my job of sort of essentially justifying the continuation of this capability, or certainly thinking about being very circumspect before one was to give them up. It's found myself returning to the very sort of principles and precepts against which the technology was invented, and really in many ways it validates the kind of enduring business of why tanks were invented in the first place, because so much we focus so much on what's changed, what's changing, and sometimes I'm a fan of thinking about the fixed points in this sort of scenario and what hasn't changed. And tanks still answer the same fundamental problem that they answered when they were invented. And Cambrai produces a really interesting and useful backdrop to talk about the tank. And as many of you will no doubt be aware, tagged as really the first moment of when it was employed en masse in an orchestrated fashion, and in that sense the kind of birth of what we would term in professional military as combined arms warfare. And I before I sort of kick off with anything, I'm always acknowledging that the Western Front Association is a very broad audience, and some of you out there will know more of the detail on some of this than I do. Many of you may, if I'm honest, but many of you won't really be nearly as familiar with these concepts. So I'm hoping that all of you will get some value out of this evening, but naturally enough, some of you will get more, because there's nothing worse than talking over people, and I will assume essentially no knowledge. So two things really stand out for me with this business of the tank. As I've said, it's the timelessness of the challenge that tanks were invented to resolve, as well as how their fundamental limitations have endured and expressed themselves in the battle that we're about to examine. And the other thing I often stop and think about is just the staggering technical and conceptual leap that this particular innovation represented. And those of you who are familiar with my very, very limited canon of 3 books, or some of the things that I've said before to the Western Front Association, will appreciate that the backdrop to my interest in the Great War was really in experiencing what's often quite a lazy historiography. And in the sort of 15 or 20 years or so that I've been interested in this area, I have seen I would argue a marked improvement in the quality of the historiography, but particularly in the sort of amongst the cognoscenti, you might say. But of course, the popular conceptions still taught to us by the likes of Mel Gibson through Gallipoli or Blackadder. They do tend to prevail. But to my mind, along with some of the other innovations that I've spoken about before and will return to in this talk, the tank is a really signal refutation of the argument in some circles, or the assumption perhaps is a better way of putting it, that this was an unthinking army staffed by unthinking officers who weren't beset on getting to grips with what's oft termed the revolution in military affairs. And so some of you see my lectures before may be familiar with the fact that I throw up this wonderful painting by de Neuville of Rorke's Drift, because it's the army that these innovators joined. And when I use the word innovators, not necessarily the younger people who are on the front line making these capabilities work, but the sponsors of these capabilities. And my now familiarity with institutional decision making, nothing gets through without the buy-in and patronage of senior thinkers. And these senior thinkers started their war professions in the fashion that you can see, with single shot weaponry, artillery guns that fire over open sights, etc. And the architect or if you like, the patron of the tank at Cambrai, General Sir Julian Byng, he commissioned in 1882. He served in Sudan and the Second Boer War, irregular cavalry. I mean, his curriculum vitae leading up to the First World War was your absolute classic exemplar of the sort of Victorian empire soldier. And it's an extraordinary thing to reflect that these gentlemen retired from military service in an army which would be more recognizable, say, to me as a professional soldier today than they would have anyone in that painting. And so, and even at the beginning of the First World War, again, it's worth reflecting that these Baluch infantry outside Ypres, we were still adopting the same sort of tactics and precepts which had been hard won in the Boer War, but the fundamentals of firing artillery over open sights, etc. These things were still in play. But all too quickly, as we know, and really I'm teaching almost all of you to suck eggs at this point, but we'll rattle on, is what a management consultant would call the problem statement. And this is really fundamentally how to protect infantry in the assault with this enormous disparity in technologies that had occurred. And really it's about and I've spoken about this before to the Western Front Association, but I think it is encapsulated for those of you who are less familiar with this particular issue. It really sort of sits on the fulcrum of getting across no man's land to an objective, and then needing to defend and consolidate it against trench systems which are now facing the wrong way. And it really does, so much of it boils down to that real simplicity of, I can get over quickly and I can take this thing. And people through late 14, 15, they were doing this very successfully. But the things you needed to do to get over worked against you when you needed to consolidate. And so you ended up with this sort of back and forth where people would then say, okay, to redress the issue of having lost what they'd gained, they'd carry more equipment, weigh themselves down, and hence we see people moving encumbered and very slowly. And set against a backdrop of a complete disparity in battlefield communication, such that you still have essentially, once you're across the line of departure, as it were, you're communicating the same way people had done for millennia, with runners and bugles and whistles and so forth. Field telephones being their limit, being the point of departure. Whereas, of course, as we all well know, the other killing if you like, technologies had stripped on. And against also another backdrop of, you could say, really quite significant external subjectivities for soldiers wrestling with these problems of disparities in procurement and the timelines therein, so that you know what piece of equipment you want, but when it's not there in time for when you need it, and by the time that stuff arrives, it's been answering yesterday's question. Hence very, very well understood issues around the wrong type of artillery shells on the Somme, etc. You also have the issue of training regression with hugely expanding armies, and the politics and the pressure to keep pushing and keep acting even against your better professional judgment, which is probably the one part of the conversation, that study of the Great War, when one's looking at the conduct of war and the battles, and the interesting bit, if you like, for people looking back, those political subjectivities are often lost on the observer, because they're just not as interesting, and they don't play into the equation so visibly. So we're just going to take a quick canter through some of the other technologies that were being advanced at the same time as the tank arrived on the scene. And you've got artillery, first of all, the gunners' war fought by infantry, as the old aphorism goes. And I think one of the important things worth mentioning to anyone not overly familiar with the artillery of the First World War is misperceptions around the sort of weight of artillery and the proportion of guns which were of the heavy variety and the most destructive variety. And actually, Cambrai is very instructive in this regard. So if you think that General Byng had 1,003 guns apportioned to the Cambrai offensive, about 8 out of 10 of those were light field pieces, like you see in the top left, and only 1% were of the heaviest variety, of 12 inches or more. It actually works out at 11. He had 11 such guns attributed to him. So you can see that most of it was a business of the light end of the spectrum, including trench mortars, and the issues that they had been spending these intervening years resolving around fusing and wire cutting, the ever battle with accuracy once you're firing at things that you can't see. And that's a function of surveillance and target acquisition, weather conditions, weapon rates, the wear rates on barrels, and really quite technical equations, which are now the stuff of artillery profession, but at the time were things that people were only having to really get to grips with. And it's always fascinating to me how the sort of the central tenets of modern gunnery really owe themselves to this period of extraordinary innovation. And as we'll come on to see, the tank actually solved two of those problems, or ameliorated two of those problems on behalf of the gunners. That is wire cutting and strong point suppression. And then you had in April, Vimy Ridge, a subject dear to my heart. And again, what an extraordinarily wonderful, beautiful painting by Richard Jack. You see a lot of photographs of the First World War, but these war artists that were able to take such an illustrator's talent, if you like, and set it against what they saw is such a rich depiction. And this period of 1917 was terrific. Advances in artillery technology, particularly around finding enemy batteries which were so destructive to one's assaulting forces, and also the business of silent registration, which was for those of you who don't know, is the business of getting rounds from an artillery gun onto target without having to fire a few ranging rounds first. This is an extremely technical business of survey of gun positions, understanding the relationship between barrel wear and the heat of the barrel, and even the batch of ammunition that you're using. So you can test your guns on that particular batch of ammunition, record the target data, and then take those calculations to the front line, and then fire first round on target. I mean, really an extraordinary development, as we'll see. And this period was also seeing the perfection of a technology around creeping barrages, which had come into play for the first time in about 1915. But you see the ability of light guns like these 13 and 18 pounders to throw shells as little as 50 yards ahead of advancing infantry, and leveraging the trajectory of an artillery round to at that point to particularly when operating shrapnel shells, that the ellipse of the trajectory throws the shells forward, enabling the troops essentially to operate underneath exploding shells. It's a risky business, but really shows that how people were completely on top of their game. And you also had aircraft, and this is another huge leap. You think that the British employed about 50 aircraft at the front end of the war, and by this stage we're operating over 1,000. That's a DH-4 bomber on the top and the old Sopwith Camel at the bottom. But you're starting to see aircraft developing specialisms around role, including multi-role aircraft, which is sort of where modern air forces are starting to coalesce around. And you're seeing our aircraft revolutionizing the business of survey, spotting artillery rounds, as people were still doing from aircraft today and in the Vietnam War, and concepts of layered air campaigning, which would be which a modern Air Force officer would understand straight away, around depth interdiction, offensive counter-air, fighter ground attack, etc. This was the period when all these modern principles were being brought to bear. And forgive me cantering quickly because we're trying to get to the main effort here, and infantry tactics as well. We've already spoken a little bit about training regression, but they were making great gains in infantry tactics. And again, we'll see that the sort of principles that they were starting to apply of suppression of the objective, maneuver around it, and then maintaining an element in reserve to either exploit or protect. These are again concepts which have completely unchanged, born in this crucible of innovation, and stand today as testament to that. So what about the tank? And you'll forgive me, I'm going to take a slurp of brew. I went to a Mark Knopfler concert at Dire Straits a few years ago, and he's getting on a bit now, and he brought a cup of tea onto the stage. So I thought, well, if Mark Knopfler can do it, I can. Where are we? So to the old, the tank. And really, for all of those innovations that I've just described, the creeping barrage and box barrages around objectives to sort of to protect infantry, the intimate and direct support to the infantry was still eluding the British Army at this period, and people had to cross those last few yards and deal with bunkers and strong points which were seemingly often impervious to barrage. And here I really do want to take a pause to think about just what a staggering innovation this was. And when one looks at innovation writ large, I was reading a book the other day, randomly enough for this subject area, but about the Gutenberg Bible. And what you see with some extraordinary innovations like this is they're not necessarily reaching forward into the future. They're reaching astride themselves. And in Gutenberg's case, he took the business of pressing a Bible actually from the wine trade of the era. And you see with the tank that there are really two technologies which these innovators registered were relevant. And the first was the advances in the late 19th century into caterpillar tracks. And just again, stop and think for a second about what a clever piece of lateral thinking that is, that for years you've either built a road or you've rolled logs, and to think actually I can bring the road to the vehicle is an extraordinary piece of lateral thinking. And then a lot of these empire era campaigns, people were riverine operations and coast littoral operations where gunboats were operating in direct support of the infantry. And it's that thinking of, okay, I'd take tractor technology to get a heavy vehicle able to move across rough terrain, and we'll take naval guns essentially and park them on the land, and hence the wonderfully and famously titled Land Ships Committee. And this early model here, you've got the original Little Willie, which is effectively a copy of the Hornsby chain tractor, which morphed very quickly into that rhomboid, if infamous now, rhomboid shape, which was all about the gap crossing requirement. And in modern military procurement, you'd call that a key user requirement document. In this case, they registered that it needed to climb a step of just shy of 5 feet and cross a gap of just shy of 9. But the design there was essentially taking that brilliant premise that I described and championed by some really young and energetic characters. And again, we've all I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with Hugh Ells, who was a brigadier general aged 37. That's a good 10 years on me, and had only been a major in February 1915 when this project went underway. And as we're aware, and as a lot of you will be aware, the debut was inauspicious, and the language they used at the time at Fleur-Courcelette in September 1916 was using tanks as an adjunct, quote, an adjunct to infantry attack. And that essentially, in simple parlance, it means penny packeted. And the architects of Cambrai acknowledged that was not the best use of armor, and it still isn't. And we'll come on and talk more about that later. But just in terms of the fundamental design principles that these characters were dealing with, and none of this has changed. And you have the sort of zero-sum triumvirate of mobility, protection, and firepower. And these early designs were fundamentally compromised in all three of those areas. And this, again, will be familiar to so many of you, is the Mark IV. The intermediate marks were really for trials and development. So the only 2 marks fielded was the one that we saw just previously, and then the 4, which had a few design improvements I'll come on to in a second. But fundamentally, in terms of mobility, these vehicles had no suspension systems, and that meant that they were bone jarring, and it made it absolutely almost impossible to fire on the move, which was their fundamental limitation in terms of their firepower. Because it's not just about firing on the move, it's about acquiring targets on the move, such as you then stop and fire, as actually a lot of tanks were still doing throughout the 20th century. And it's the problem with no suspension and tiny vision slits is it's actually very difficult to see anything. And then in terms of protection, these tanks had only the rudiments of sort of pig iron. And so they hadn't perfected any of the technologies that would come later around sloping armor or what's called face hardening armor, where it's tempered such that otherwise what occurs is brittle, as when you strike an object on the outside, or an incoming round, you get that sort of equal and opposite effect, and the armor comes off the inside of the vehicle, and that's called spalling. Modern armored vehicles, this can still occur with a modern armored vehicle, and a lot of modern armored vehicles still have what's called an anti-spall lining, particularly infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers do this. And you also had an issue in protection, which they used to call splash, which is where these vision slits would be aimed at by the opponent, or rounds would impact there willy-nilly, and the jackets would come away, and small sharp pieces of jagged metal would fling around on the inside of the tank. So mobility, issues of suspension, and then as a consequence also speed and reliability, protection, spalling and splash, and then firepower, total lack of target acquisition. But they did have a reasonable weapon systems, and you can see there, this is a female variant with the Lewis gun. And for those of you who are really interested in the detail here, Lewis gun selected predominantly because it had a 100-round pan magazine on top of it, whereas belt-fed or the Hotchkiss, using a sort of a rail methodology, overcomplicated the business for the crewmen clambering around inside. And that kind of brings me to the next point here, which is about human factors integration, as they would say now in modern armored vehicle design. And this was an absolute horror show of human factors integration. Hideous for the crew involved. It gets very hot in there. You've got noxious fumes. It's too noisy to communicate. People talk about hitting things with a hammer or hitting their mates on the head. the Mark 1 had an internal fuel tank. This Mark 4 at least had an external fuel tank, but you've still got a vehicle which is leaking oil, and everyone's wearing black coveralls, and it was the British that invented the black coverall, not the Panzer command crews of the Second World War, but coveralls which are themselves soaked in oil. So as soon as any kind of fire starts in this thing, and with pathetically small egress hatches, and if I can use my cursor, you can see the egress hatches on the side there. And you see some pretty macabre photographs when you go into the archives at the Tank Museum and the Imperial War Museum of the sort of immolated remains of soldiers who've attempted to get out of these vehicles in a hurry in a fire and failed. And there's oft references to people, passing out from noxious fumes. I think sometimes that's overstated, but it was still certainly a problem which war diaries and memoirs will attest to. And at the speed I'm moving, I forgot to mention that the male variant had a couple of 6-pounder naval guns, only one of which on the starboard side could actually fire forward. So again, sort of slightly compromised in terms of firepower. Nevertheless, while we're criticizing them for all of these issues or nodding to all of these issues, the simple fact that they got a prototype in action by September 1915, having only invented this thing in February 1915, and then by the middle of 1917 had a sort of a workable mass-produced variant capable of the things that I'm about to describe, is an absolutely stunning achievement. And you think nowadays that procurement timelines for complex military projects are sometimes measured in decades. It was an absolutely staggering feat. So where were you going to realize the potential of all of these things? And this is where we get to Cambrai, or Cambrai. I don't know. I'll go with the latter. It's a bounded objective is the sort of the key headline here. And the German retreat operation Armoured to the Siegfriedstellen on the Hindenburg line had opened up sort of the proximity of Cambrai to planners. And as you can see from that map, from the original, the official history, it was a major transport hub. There are railway lines, terminus of, or at least a junction of many railway lines. North of that chart, you've got the Sensee River, which was used for logistics with barges, and then the Saint Quentin Canal, which you can just see flowing out of Cambrai and down the back end of the battlefield there. This made it quite a useful little objective. But the fact that it had the canal, the river, and there was also the dry Canal du Nord running there, which hadn't been completed at this stage, you can see that for a raid, it was absolutely superlative, because a raid is therefore bounded against counterattack. And Cambrai, the Operation GY, as it was called, as a contingency, originally was born as a raid, not a sort of a broader sort of deliberate offensive. But it morphed into that for two reasons. One was they realized that the Germans were quite lightly defended in this area. Only I say only 2 divisions. German army still only has 2 divisions now, I think, but 2 divisions in the area, and the political pressures associated with a period of the war where the Battle of Third Ypres, which you can see referenced on that little map here, had gone badly. And all of the concomitant pressures associated with America still trying to get into the war, the Russians having their revolution, etc., etc., etc. So this is why this is how these things creep from very realistic and bounded objectives into something potentially a little bit more ambitious, and that in a sense was where the sort of the you could argue the seeds of failure. And the fun statistic, which will please a lot of people, is, and it's been mentioned a lot of times before when I put it in my book all the way back in 2007, was that they had 378 fighting variants mustered for the Battle of Cambrai, and another 98 unarmed of the sort of tender tank variants. But in the 2010 SDSR, we had 386 tanks in the British Army, and now 227 at current count. So again, back to what I'm saying about what was a modern, expensive emergent technology mustered in extraordinary numbers, with the professionalized tank corps by this stage, and and good to go, with training and doctrine to match. And I still marvel at the speed at which they generated these things. So this is a slightly busy map, but it's useful for me to sort of talk to it. And it shows the shape of the battlefield. And Cambrai, we're going to have to canter through a lot of the detail here, and there's so much of it to find for those that you are interested. I think David, I don't think it was David that authored a really good article on the Western Front Association website on this battle. So there's lots out there, but I'll sketch it for you now. As the cliche goes, it's essentially a game of two halves, and which sort of led ultimately to a 1-1 draw. And if I go back a slide, actually, you can see this little chart shows you the changing fortune. So this dotted line here was as far as they got, and then the Germans counterattacked, and you ended up with that being the end result. So you would say it. So if this was the pools in the 1980s, we were tuning in at the end of grandstand, it would be 1-1 draw. And two things I think really stand out for me about the battle in the way that it was conceived. The first notable feature was security. It was an extraordinary amount of security associated with it, and that I think is in large part associates with its provenance as a raid, where surprise on a raid is essential because you're not necessarily massing that many troops, and you intend to get out again pretty quickly. And this was where silent registration of artillery came in, because normally in a battle like this, you'd have an enormous amount of preparatory barrage, which was a sort of always a trade-off, because you'd want to soften up enemy strong points. You needed to cut wire, but you didn't want to give your opponent too much warning to sort of amass reserves. And this is where the balance of artillery technology around silent registration and the advent of tanks to provide close support meant they no longer had to bother with wire cutting. They could trust to the tanks to suppress strong points, and they could deal with enemy counter-battery fire through the business of silent registration. So quite a risk in the sense that these concepts had been proved, but they weren't mature. And to aid this, there was some extraordinary levels of effort with the logistic build-up. And if you can think how much men and material are flowing into a theatre of operations like this, it was a pretty significant feat. And they actually they broke the rear areas into very specific zones, where the forward zones you weren't allowed to move during daylight unless you were in groups of two, and those groups of two themselves had to be 100 yards apart, and so on and so forth as you went back to as far as the observation balloons could see. And the tanks being brought up by train and then pushed up to the front lines in the dark. And there's some quite fun anecdotes of we've all soldiers listening will know that feeling where you're trying to move into position in the dark and you lose your guides and you lose the tape. And one young tank officer was looking for the tracks of the tank that had gone before him by the light of a cigarette. It must have been in a bit of a flap. And so the second business was the orchestration of all the different effects that I'm talking about earlier on. So use of artillery, and the other big player in this element was air power. And the tricky thing with air power, particularly on the day of the race, and thinking, okay, I'm going to use my aircraft to, and Bing's plan was to use aircraft in depth to bomb the headquarters of Group of Cavalry, which was the German formation in this area, to strafe and interdict reinforcement and reserves moving up, to deal with railway junctions that would be used to detrain those reserves, and offensive counter-air operations to keep German aircraft out of the area. You've got to fly through artillery shells. And nowadays, this is all very well understood. Process known as battle space management. We've got to put a bit of jargon on it in the military, but it was understood, these dangers, and they got around this by flying aircraft at very low level, and there was some pretty fruity flying going on to achieve it. But they use their light guns for a creeping barrage, intimate protection of the assaulting forces. Heavier guns registered silently. That's the 9-inch howitzers, the 9.2-inch howitzers, and those big guns that I mentioned, dealing with German artillery batteries, and then aircraft working the depth, and tanks, as I've mentioned, on wire cutting duties. So you had enormous security, matchless orchestration, superlative logistics. This was one of Bing's strong points as a commander. And the whole show was nearly thrown open by a raid conducted by the Germans on the Ulster division, and a couple of Ulstermen spilt the beans under pressure there. But the Germans didn't get enough information and didn't get it in time. That raid was on the 18th of November, and they still thought that it was going to be a smaller and localized attack. They didn't know what was coming. So it's going to take pause for a brew before it kicks off. So what was it like? I think it's fantastic to read some of the primary source material associated with this. And I think for those of you who aren't particularly familiar with the battle or the terrain, the first thing that's worth thinking about was that people, when they crossed the line of departure that morning, weren't moving into a churned up landscape. And because there had been no preparatory bombardment, and this was a part of the line which the Germans had withdrawn to. So the Germans had built these enormous, erected these enormous swathes of barbed wire, and had been able to do so out of contact, almost a sea of barbed wire. But the infantry were advancing not across the churned up landscape that you'd imagine. And that photograph on the right is a party of one of the brigade headquarters of the 51st Highland Division on the day of the race, 20th of November, at Cambrai. So you can see the type of landscape that they were dealing with. It kicked off essentially still in the dark. It's November. There was a low-lying mist, and that humidity that you get at this time of year, as we all feeling when we go and walk our dogs, it traps the sound, and I often imagine the cacophony of the creeping barrage and the crump and the flattening of all of the sound of these artillery shells going off, and then as troops got into contact with the forward outpost zones, and the tanks got their weapon systems into action, and the infantry spread out, as you can see from that wonderful illustration from Peter Dennis of from the book that we worked on together, of tanks shaking out on the objective, and the infantry operating in their worms behind them, and the infantry talk about plodding across no man's land and walking on the crushed barbed wire, which sort of, I guess, would be like tabbing on a massive Brillo pad. But you can imagine the relief of the infantry, veterans of which are used to some hideous experience of getting hung up in the wire, to walk behind a clattering heavy tank and just bounce across it effectively. Must have been extraordinary. The aircraft whipping in so low that some of them report actually leaping over the tanks. And when I was researching my book, I came across an absolute gem, which is one of the pilots saying he could spot all the soldiers in the pre-dawn gloom, or the dawn gloom, by their cigarette ends, which tells you how relaxed they were if they were still smoking at this juncture. And the initial gains were pretty extraordinary, 3 to 4 miles deep across a sort of a 6-mile frontage, and in some similar gains made in the early stages of the Battle of Arras, but it's still sort of broadly an unprecedented affair. But it didn't stay that way for long, and there's 3 reasons really. One is that the fear factor around tanks was just no longer the case. The Germans were familiar enough with them and their fragility that they didn't cause the panic that's often associated with their use earlier in 1917, and of course when they first were employed on the Somme. The Germans had built some significant strong points around farm systems like Pam Pam and a Pave farm in the center of the line, which did not fall without a fight. And tanks, despite the ability of getting in close to these things, they still had to be ultimately winkled out by infantry at the point of a bayonet. It was one of these actions actually where the tank corps got their one VC of the VC of the battle was a tank that had been disabled, and a Captain Richard Wayne hopped out, dismounted a Lewis gun, and did for the position sort of the old-fashioned way. Sadly, a posthumous VC. But where the attack was successful, of course, they instantly came up against the canal, which was originally their protection, and now was sort of holding them back. And the master plan of taking the canal crossings and then pushing the cavalry through proved a lot more problematic. The Germans denying some of these crossings. You've got the F-22, the Flying Fox, which took one of these bridges to see if it could get across, and collapsed it in a huge hissing cloud of steam. And so very limited numbers of cavalry did make it across on that first day, but were repulsed. And so really it is interesting that you can see that what was clever design for a limited operation and a raid actually ended up doing for it. And then there's the vulnerability of the tanks themselves. And one of the more famous episodes of this first day of the battle is Flesquier Ridge in the center. And if we go back to the map, you can see that here in the center of the line, which was the objective for the 51st Highland Division. And again, it's pretty well known. The General Harper had some reservations about putting his infantry in close proximity to tanks in training, and a lot of histories associate this decision with the disaster that befell the tanks at Flesquier. But I think it's actually much more to do with the fact that they came down a reverse slope and encountered some of the German forward field gun positions, and these gunners had been trained in anti-tank gunnery and direct fire gunnery, and this is where this triumvirate I was describing of mobility, firepower, and protection all came home to roost, because it was an poorly matched fight, really, where these tanks were trundling along, trying to acquire these artillery pieces, which had a lot more agility, a lot better visibility, and from fixed positions. This photograph, I think, is actually from Third Eep, but you can see the holes knocked in the side of these things, that the armor was just not up to the task. And this was, so when you look at the numbers of tanks that actually ditched and were knocked out in this fashion on the first day, they actually suffered near enough a 50% attrition rate, 179 tanks out of the 378 destroyed or ditched on the first day. So you really can see that these were still defined by their limitations on day one of the battle. But nevertheless, an extraordinary, as I said, level of achievement, and really as the first day closed, without the breakthrough and the loss of surprise, it really became a race between the offensive and the German reserves. And it's predictably enough, with hindsight, you can see that really on the second day, the whole thing lost its impetus, and bringing troops up across no man's land, even though they had used these tender tanks to drag supplies, the sappers, good old sappers. Els was a sapper, loved the sappers, such hardworking people. They did everything they could to get the roads across no man's land and get ammunition and guns and everything else forward. But it's really, again, trying to recock and reset something like this with the communications limitations they had. Some attacking companies on the second day didn't get their orders until just before dawn, and of course no time for them to take their time to prepare and get organized. And it was a pretty miserable night, and by this stage people had been on the move for 24 hours, fighting and marching by the close of the first day. So by the time they went back into the attack, that's 36 hours, no hot food, wet, your boots are wet, your pants are wet, and pretty exhausting. And so no surprises really. So they took a day's pause, and then the idea on the 23rd, that's 103 years ago today, was to get this northern part of the battlefield organized, because they essentially registered that the canal was just not a going concern. After the second day, it was clear to them this wasn't going to happen, and they could hear the Germans in detraining in Cambrai itself, and but they reckoned that if they could get Boulogne and Fontaine up in the north here, they could consolidate a line which would, for the winter, which would dominate these canals and dominate the canal crossings. So not an unreasonable decision, and particularly as the at that stage when the decisions were made, Fontaine was still being lightly held by the Jocks. So it took a day to recock and went for the northern part of the battlefield. And this is where the tanks showed their vulnerability a second time, both to direct fire and these K-flak, these are motorized anti-aircraft guns. And if you were ever wondering where the Germans got the idea from for the infamous 88 in the Second World War, I think that's the technical photographic evidence. And they did for 7 of the 19 tanks which tried to get into the village of Fontaine Notre Dame from the outskirts of the village, and the tanks got separated from their infantry, and you know, the sort of symbiosis of tanks and infantry wasn't as well understood in this dawn as it is now, and so the tanks pushed on into the town, and that's one of the tanks in the village of Fontaine after the battle. And here the Germans dealt with them with bundles of hand grenades put into a sandbag, tied at the top with one stick grenade to let the other ones off, roll it under the tracks, and they were able to disable a lot of the tanks there. And then, of course, once you can start clambering around on top and stuffing grenades in, and so on and so forth, it was a pretty bloody affair for the tanks in that village. And I might just take this opportunity to read an eyewitness account, which those of you who if any of you have read my book will be familiar with. But this was from a Captain Groves of OC number 1 section of the B battalion, which had pushed on into Fontaine. All hell was let loose as we turned into the street. We were being fired at from the roofs, the front, the back, and the sides. A combination of splash and armor flaking made it most difficult to see anything when handling the gun. The gun ports were all lit up with sparks. Imagine the shouting required to get our 6-pounder guns onto the enemy machine guns in the houses. Whenever I spotted a target, I had to yell instructions in the driver's ear, then dash over the other side of the tank to the gunner, pinch or punch him to attract his attention, ball in his ear. The atmosphere at this time was warming up with the engine fumes and propellant fumes from the gun black flash. There were 2 men wounded. All the crew's faces were covered in blood. And then, as I was observing through the periscope, I was pinched violently in the leg, looked around and saw the tank was on fire at the back by the batteries. I pointed to the door and Sergeant Stewart stood by with his hand to open it. I can honestly say at this point, I thought death by fire or death by bullets. Well, bullets for my own choice. They were banging on the door like large hailstones on plate glass. But fortunately, we managed to put the fire out with all 3 of our extinguishers and maneuver the tank out of the village to safety. And that little color photograph top right is a musician, because one of the tanks was we know from German memoirs was taken down by 2 trained stormtroopers who also happened to be the regimental band. So it's going to take us too far off track, and with the limited time available to really stress in too much detail the remainder of the battle. But I think there's two key chapters to it, really. You had the effort to gain Boulogne Ridge and the wood that dominated it. My own regiment, the Irish Guards, took part in that battle, and the Lieutenant Colonel, later Field Marshal Alexander, was commanding the 2nd Battalion there. When I was researching my book, I went to the archive and found a receipt for prisoners, which was still in a box. An original receipt had the muddy thumbprint where the Lance Sergeant had torn a page out of his notebook, and a receipt for 7 German prisoners of war. It was a wonderful thing to touch. And then that largely failed to consolidate those positions by the 27th of November, and on the 30th, the Germans counterattacked. This was a showcase for their own emergent innovations, and one of the first times that they made successful use of their stormtrooper tactics, which had already been in evidence at Passchendaele. but triggered some pretty significant reverses. And again, you can see from this map, which I have taken from the book, of how the lines eventually organized themselves. And being the surprise, the bells had rung on the 20th, and there was recrimination. People couldn't understand or were frustrated by how those extraordinary gains of that first day unraveled. And being Britain, there had to be an independent inquiry, and it was led by Jan Smuts. And it's not a very edifying story, because being rather uncharacteristically for him as a commander, always showed affinity for troops and broad-mindedness, concurred with the report's findings that the British route, as it was felt to have been, was a function of poor discipline among junior ranks and poor training. And Bing's biographer insists that Bing was talking about the troops having been let down by inadequate training. But what I find always rather sort of peculiarly British about these instances is that people are so slow to acknowledge that maybe they were just out-soldiered. And the Germans, what was essentially a counterattack rather than an offensive, a deliberate counterattack, but a counterattack nonetheless, mounted a pretty stellar operation with these lightning tactics, good use of air power, and what little artillery they had. And I think it's the exhaustion of the people involved on the British side was probably a significant factor, and that certainly features in some of the post-operational reports from the from the time. But I think the truth is, the reality with Cambrai is that some old truths really rather reinserted themselves. The first of which was the sort of difficulty, really, of once you've gained something, of consolidating it and exploiting it, because of overcrowding and effectively congestion on the very limited number of routes. This is a photograph from the battle of a motorcycle machine gun battalion and the cavalry on one of the lateral routes up to the front, and that's even before you add to that reinforcing infantry, of which they didn't have enough, and of course the business of getting field guns and their insatiable appetite for artillery ammunition forward as well. So there's those time-honored issues, and then also there's just the simple fact that when you're trying to exploit, it's back to our triumvirate. The tanks lack the mobility to really exploit gains, moving as slowly as they did and being thirsty. The cavalry had the mobility but lacked the protection, and the poor bloody infantry lacked both mobility and protection. So it was always going to be a tricky business. And I think the way I put it when I wrote about it was that you see in this battle, from a staggering sort of surprise and effort on the first day, a general, I quoted in my book, a general attenuation of effort. And then there's the other timeless business, as I've mentioned, of a German interior lines advantage with reserves, exhaustion of the fighting man, and just the difficulties of getting things for any kind of exploitation up to the same level of preparedness as the sort of the overture or the opening act of all of these operations. It was so often the case. So as I've often said, battle winning strategies were never necessarily campaign or war winning strategies, and the rest, as they say, is history. So I really prefer to dwell with Cambrai, as I said at the beginning, on the extraordinarily auspicious occasion that it was, and this is particularly when, as I've said, the business of orchestrating all of these different components of what's now sort of second nature to professional soldiers around quote unquote combined arms maneuver, and the sort of maturity of some of these tactical precepts was really quite staggering. And so I'm gonna throw in a couple of slides by way of conclusion, which I first used when I was speaking to the Somme Association about 5 years ago about innovation in the First World War more broadly. The first of these is tank infantry integration, and a nod to Following the Tanks, a great book, using the chart on the left there of showing infantry tank integration of the era. And you can see that they divided armor allocations with infantry into an advanced guard, which would push on and exploit a position and effectively protect it. And then what they called main body tanks, which provided intimate support to the infantry, trundling around up and down the trenches and providing that strong point suppression that I talked about. Fast forward to 2007. This is an outdated pamphlet now. I've done that intentionally, but I can assure you that the concepts are still identical. And when you look at some of the language here around the assault troop tanks and the intimate support troop tanks and the infantry lined up behind them, and then the business of how a modern tank and infantry tactical assault onto objective operates with a tanks in lateral fire support and then reorganization on the objective to protect the objective from counterattack. And the similarities are, well, to my eyes, really quite extraordinary. And then we get to the infantry. And on the left, you have that wonderful and famous infantry pamphlet from February of the year we're talking about. And then on the right-hand side, Platoon Attack from a pamphlet in 2011. And what I've found fascinating in my own career in the infantry is watching the infantry course of my career moving back to the same balance of weapon systems that they had in the First World War. So the renaissance of rifle grenades in the infantry over the last 20, 30 years, and the renaissance of after a period of vacillation on belt-fed weapons, but sort of bipod mounted suppression weapons within the infantry, and you can see all of the same concepts at play. And I really believe it to my bones that if you took an experienced infantry platoon commander or company commander from 1918 and you gave him a modern infantry section and he gave orders, everybody would be on the same page. And you know, these tactics, and particularly the sort of nuance of flanking maneuvers and maintaining a reserve and things like that, these were born in this period and have really stood the test of time. So by way of conclusion, and you look at that montage of photographs from the MOD website, and you can see that you've, indirect artillery fire using sound ranging and counter battery fire technologies, using forward observers, some of which are in the air, and these days, of course, you can do this with UAVs, fighter ground attack, armored maneuver, and infantry tactics. Our forebears of this period were extraordinary innovators, and their innovations, really the underlying principles of which have stood the test of time. And that's probably a good place to wrap it up. The final slide, couple of slides I actually have, is to cue a bit of discussion or question. Really is about this sense of, if that was the dawn of armored warfare, are we approaching the dusk of armored warfare? And I threw up on the slide a few of the technologies that people argue are going to do for it. The attack helicopter, people have been talking about this for a long time. Cyber warfare, long-range precision fires, and an infantry, intimate infantry support provided potentially by autonomous or semi-autonomous armored vehicles. And we can get to some of that discussion in questions, but in many ways, I think that when you look back to the reason that the tank was invented, the spark of innovation and the imperative it answered, those problems and issues are still with us today. And the tank grew, and mechanization of the rest of the army grew to really what was fundamentally a kind of as you'd say in military parlance, an operational asset, providing shock action to a campaign, to the maneuver of very large formations. And really the main chess piece is on the board of sort of modern warfare. And that whether battlefields become more dispersed or whether the expensiveness of these things makes armies smaller, so whether that sort of, if you like, density of heavy metal becomes an issue over the coming years and decades. I think with the simple business of protecting an infantryman in the assault against a tactical objective is probably the last thing that will go. And so in some senses, the first thing that was required will be the last thing, because you see the way that tanks are still used in civil wars and some of current conflicts in Syria and Ukraine. They're still ubiquitous, and they're still at their absolutely most indispensable when you still ultimately have scared and fleshy infantry soldiers trying to deal with strong points, and that the presence of a very large, heavy metal box, impervious to small arms fire, with a very large gun to do what needs to be done. I think I'll put it another way: a lot of people that are skeptical about these things are invariably people that have never been in a street wishing they had a tank. So we'll take it from there. Last slurp of the brew.
Mademoiselle from Armoured, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armoured.